Hi everyone, my name is Eleanor. Like they said in the introduction, I am a full-stack software engineer, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to fail successfully. So by that I mean how to overcome your fear of failure as a software engineering intern. So a little more background about me. Like they said, I'm a full-stack engineer. The company I work at is called Fellow.app. It's based in Ottawa, Canada. And I've only been full-time there for about the last 9 months. I started in January. Before that, I was an intern for a while. And so the experience of being an intern is still very fresh with me. It's still less than a year since then. And before I was an intern at Fellow, I interned at 3 other software companies during my software engineering degree. And so I've had many new starts with different companies and different code bases. And it's been my experience that being a new employee at a new company with all this new information coming in is a common situation for imposter syndrome to set in. There aren't many things in tech that I think I'm an expert in yet, but I think that I have enough first-hand experience with imposter syndrome to talk about it with you today. My experience with imposter syndrome even included preparing for this talk, so I'm very well versed in what it feels like. So let's define our terms. What is imposter syndrome? The basis of imposter syndrome is the fear of being found out. It's this idea that somehow you have convinced everyone around you that you are a lot more qualified than you actually are. And the only way that you can really combat this, at least in my experience, is just getting used to your skill set, getting comfortable in it, and learning more so that you can get used to what you actually know. And unfortunately, in that process, you're going to have to get used to asking for help. You're going to make a lot of mistakes, and you're going to have to get used to saying, I don't know. However, if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, all of these things are going to feel like personal failures, which is why I call overcoming them failing successfully. So let's take a step back and talk a little bit about what it's like being an intern. And the reason I want to do this is that although I want to target this talk to people who are current interns and people who are looking to be interns soon, it's also important, I think, to address this to managers and people who are coworkers of current interns, because they're still very relevant. However, if you're a manager or a team lead or a senior engineer, it's likely that you haven't been an intern for quite some time. So I want to take a sec just to remind you what that's like. So this is my personal experience, of course. In my degree, I worked really hard. I didn't love being a student, but I still did all the work, all the assignments as best as I could to get good grades. And I studied really hard for interviews. That meant doing all the leak code problems or whatever else you have to do to study for those. And so by doing all this studying and background stuff, I felt like I actually knew a lot of theory. I felt like I was well versed in software engineering and I could accomplish a lot. So I had confidence going into the jobs. However, if the job, if I show up on the first day and the job uses technologies that I'm unfamiliar with, then you start to sort of doubt yourself. You start to wonder, maybe I actually know nothing. Because when you are starting at a new job, you are limited to the technologies that your employer uses. And that might mean you can't show them everything that you're capable of. For instance, at Fellow, this was after 5 years of engineering school. But I wasn't very good at React. I hadn't used React very much. So all of my engineering knowledge, all of this random theory and algorithms and stuff that I could talk about, it was all narrowed down into whether or not I could actually build a good React component. And I really couldn't. I didn't know a lot of React. So that's when I started to doubt myself, and that's when imposter syndrome starts to set in. Something I think is important when you are hiring interns is making sure that you're assigning them meaningful projects. There is this management theory, I think it's called management theory X and Y, and there's a whole bunch to it. I won't go into it because I'm not a business student. But essentially it boils down to the fact that people will work the way they are expected to. So if you micromanage people and you treat them as though they are going to mess up, and you don't give them much responsibility because you don't want them to cause any problems, then that is the level at which they're going to work at. They're probably not going to be very interested in doing good work because they're going to feel like you expect them to fail. But if you give them a lot more room to grow and you show them that their opinions and their ideas are valuable, then it will let them perform at a higher level. And I think this is very relevant to the idea of the intern project. This is something that I've experienced quite a lot. When I say the intern project, I mean like a small side project or menial tasks that are assigned to interns so that they don't mess with the larger code base, or they don't delete customer data, they don't cause bugs on production. However, if you are an intern working on the intern project, you can sort of tell that the tasks that you're doing are meaningless, and it will really enforce any kind of imposter syndrome that you're already experiencing. Furthermore, if you are just working alone on this project, which was my experience a few times, it means that you're isolated and you can't learn from other people around you. You can't learn from your teammates, and you can't learn from their reviews and other things, which is something that's really important as an intern. One of the most valuable things you can get from an internship is other people's input and advice, because that's what you'll learn. I actually worked at a company one time where I was my entire Scrum team, because I was entirely on my own intern project. And so if I had been following their Scrum practices exactly, I was my own Scrum master, and I would have had to sit down by myself every morning and have a stand-up to talk about my project. But obviously that's ridiculous, and I didn't do it. But that was really the structure that I was working along. And I didn't learn anything in that internship because I was just regurgitating my existing knowledge, and I didn't have any reason to build on that. So as managers, it is important to assign interns low urgency, high importance projects. This is a term that my manager uses, and she's great with interns. And when I say low urgency, I mean if it goes over time or if it goes over budget, it's not a big deal, it's okay. It's not a very high stress environment. If the intern makes a mistake, that's all right, you can take the time to fix it, it's not very serious. However, the work that they're producing is important enough that they can see it reflected in the end product. They can see how it impacts the end users, how it is valuable to the company. And that's really, really important when you're an intern, because it will motivate you to do better work, and it will help you decrease any existing imposter syndrome. So now that I've talked about being an intern a little bit, you're probably wondering, that's all great, but how can I fail successfully? How can I overcome my fear of failure and fail successfully? So first point, ask for help. I know that is pretty straightforward, but it sort of boils down to the belief that it is okay to not know everything. It's okay to admit that you need help sometimes, because as an intern, you aren't going to know everything. The way that I think about asking for help is that the sooner that you realize that you are stuck in a position, you're up against a wall, you have tried everything, but you just can't make something work, the sooner you realize that you're in that position, the sooner you can ask for help and overcome that and just continue working. Because if you do that very quickly, it's less time stuck in that position of feeling like you don't know anything and you're worried to ask for help. And the longer you sustain that, the more imposter syndrome is going to set in. So if you can realize you're stuck, ask for help, carry on, it's like nothing happened. I actually have a story. My first week at Fellow, I was assigned some very basic tickets. At least I assumed they were basic. And I got stuck because I wasn't very familiar with React, so I was having trouble navigating the code base. And also, I couldn't figure out the framework we were using. It's called Prose Mirror, if anyone's familiar with it. It's for document collaboration. And I started to really doubt myself in this position, because again, 5 years engineering experience, and yet I couldn't complete these really basic tasks. But I was comparing myself as well to the other intern who I knew was really good at React, so that didn't help anything. And we were working on the same tickets, and I knew that he was probably just killing them, just doing great, and I was not able to do anything at all. And so eventually I realized I wasn't going to be able to make any progress on these. And I realized that the best person to ask for help was actually going to be the other intern. And this was really hard for me because I didn't want to admit that I needed help from the other person that was supposed to be at the same level as I was. But I had to swallow my pride and realize that I needed help, so I asked him, I messaged him very cautiously on Slack, and I said, hey, I'm stuck. And luckily he said, yeah, thank God, I'm also really confused. This code makes no sense. And I was so relieved, and we were able to work together and complete the tickets. It all turned out great. But it really helped my imposter syndrome to know that I wasn't the only one feeling confused. And I never would have come to that realization if I hadn't reached out and asked for help. And also, it was really helpful to know that I was actually capable of completing the work that I was assigned, even though it meant having to collaborate with someone else. I was still capable. I could still do things in that position. So as an intern, what are some things that we can do to make it less scary to ask for help? Because it is an intimidating thing to do. Something that's really helped me whenever I ask for help is presenting questions in the context of what I already do know. So by that I mean, if you're saying, hey, I'm stuck, this is the error message I got, can you fix it? That feels like you're admitting that you can't do anything. But instead, if you say, hey, I was writing this function, I got stuck at this line because I wasn't sure about this, whatever other function I'm calling, I've tried X, Y, and Z, I've read this documentation, I'm just stuck about this little part, can you explain that to me? That, first of all, is going to make it a lot easier for the other person to answer your question, but also it's going to make it feel less as though you're admitting that you don't know things, because you are telling them all of the things that you do know. You're just missing one puzzle piece that maybe they can provide you with. Secondly, like I've said before, always remember that no one in software knows everything. When you're new to the industry, it might feel like you're surrounded by people who know so much stuff. But realistically, it is a massive world, and it's impossible for everyone in software to know everything about everything. So as a team, what can you do to help interns feel less intimidated asking for help? I think this is underrated, but encouraging collaboration and socializing within a team is really helpful, because instead of asking people who are complete strangers for help, you can ask someone that you might think is your friend or you have some degree of personal connection with. And that makes it a lot easier because at least you have a basis with that person to work off of, as opposed to just approaching someone out of the blue. And finally, when you are answering questions, if possible, I think it's really helpful to provide guidance as opposed to just a solution. So you don't even necessarily have to give a straight answer. You can say, hey, have you checked out these docs? Have you read this article? Have you looked in this file at this function? Have you seen what this other person wrote about it? Because that way the intern will actually, or whoever's asking the question, will actually learn something from that answer as opposed to just getting a block of code back. Because if you just send them a block of code, you're probably going to get that same question a week later because they haven't learned anything from it. But if you can provide them guidance, it will be really helpful for both of you. Secondly, you can really help. Imposter syndrome is very scary because the idea of making mistakes is one of the worst things that could possibly happen in that scenario. And unfortunately, you are going to make mistakes. It is going to happen. And that's really all there is to it. You just have to get used to the idea that you are going to make mistakes. It doesn't mean that you aren't qualified. It doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It's just something that happens sometimes. So what can we do to come to terms with this idea? Well, just make the most of it. I know that's a cliche. I know that's, it might seem obvious, but it is sometimes difficult. And I have a story that I think about every day, pretty much, of a silly mistake I made a long time ago. I was at a cafe. I was making my coffee, they had given it to me, and I was trying to figure out where the sugar shaker was because I like sugar in my coffee. And so I put what I thought was sugar in my coffee, and the barista turns around and says, why are you putting salt in your coffee? Why would you want that? And instead of acknowledging that I had made a mistake and that I had done something wrong, I said, no, actually, I love salt in my coffee. I'm just gonna take this. Thank you, though. And I went and I had the nastiest drink of my whole life just because I was too proud or embarrassed or awkward to admit that I had made a very innocent mistake. And I could have just said, can I have a new coffee instead? But I didn't. I don't know why, but I just couldn't do it in that moment. And this I want to use as an analogy here because it would seem to be very easy to say, hey, I did something wrong. This was silly. I don't know why I did that, but can you help me? Can we fix this together? Because it would be so easy to just make me a new coffee. But in that moment, that was the hardest thing to do in the world. So mistakes will happen in a variety of scenarios. We're all human, we all make mistakes all day long, and unfortunately, you spend a lot of your time at work. And so you're going to make a decent percentage of your mistakes at work. And the best you can really do is try to make the most of it in this situation and move on and hope that it doesn't happen again. Do everything you can to learn from it and put it in place so that you hope it doesn't happen again. There are a few things that I think we can do as management to make it less scary and make it less likely that serious mistakes will happen at work. First, I really hope no one is actually doing this, but don't encourage a culture of blame. I think that when a serious, like let's say worst case scenario, a major bug goes to production, your first instinct shouldn't be, okay, let's point fingers, let's figure out whose fault this was, who can we pin the blame on. Your instinct should be instead, let's collectively figure out how we can solve this issue. And that will make it easier for whoever it was, maybe someone was actually responsible for this bug, it will make it easier for them to help you figure out what went wrong, as opposed to them being too scared to mention anything because they're worried of having the blame on them. Secondly, I've always been really inspired by managers that I've had who've admitted to times that they've made serious mistakes, because it helps me realize that it's very human to do so, and you can rise through the ranks. You can still have a successful career and have made mistakes in the past. And finally, for everyone's peace of mind, there are a lot of software processes that you can put around your development life cycle, like CI pipelines or just stringent review processes, so that the worst mistakes don't actually make it that far. I think this will really help everyone feel a little more safe with the idea of making mistakes. So finally, my biggest point is saying I don't know. And I know this sounds a little counterintuitive, but I don't mean just say I don't know everywhere all the time, but be confident in what you do know, but also be transparent in what that limit is and what you still need to learn. So by that I mean know what you know and what you don't know. And like I said, this might be counterintuitive. It might feel like you're admitting as though you're underqualified or unintelligent, but if you can genuinely sit down with yourself and figure out what you do know about a topic, if you can define this boundary of this is what I do know and figure out the limits of your knowledge, once you establish that, you can be very transparent with people when you're talking with them about what you don't know, and it will feel less like an admittance of some personal failure because you've established, look, this is all the stuff that I do know, that just happens to be outside of this range. Plus, it will help with imposter syndrome because imposter syndrome is telling you that everyone believes you know a lot more than you do. But if you can be honest and say, hey, this is what I do know, this is what I don't know, it's really impossible for imposter syndrome to tell you that you are making something up or that people are convinced you're more qualified than you are. This is really helpful when responding to questions, feedback, and criticism. This was a situation that used to give me a lot of anxiety because first I was worried that people would ask me questions I didn't know the answer to, or that they would point out things that I did wrong while I was presenting to everybody. But if you can remember why you think you're right, why you made the decisions when you're coding, and also be transparent about what you have left to learn, it really decreases your anxiety in that environment, and it makes you feel less defensive when people ask you questions or suggest that maybe you could have done something differently. When people do, maybe they ask you a question, say, hey, why did you use this approach instead of that one? You can discuss your thought process instead of being like, oh, they think I'm doing it wrong. They think I made a mistake. You can say, hey, this is why I did it this way. I appreciate your input. Maybe we can figure out a better solution together. You can be curious about their input and you can collaborate on a new solution. Something that's helped me as an intern in these situations where people are asking me questions is just practicing being, again, very transparent and saying very simple things like, can you clarify what you mean? Maybe they asked a really confusing question, you need more context. Or that's a really good point, I hadn't thought about it like that. Or just, I don't know, is a valid answer. It is quite possible someone asks you a question and you don't know the answer to it. And that's all right. In that moment, you shouldn't make up an answer that sounds right, which is something that I used to try to do. That doesn't benefit anybody. The most efficient thing to do in that moment is just to say, I don't know, I can find out later, I will let you know, but right now, I don't know. And honestly, that's okay. And on the topic of remembering why you think you're right, don't assume that other people are always right, even if you feel like you aren't very qualified. There are a lot of ways that other people might seem right that aren't actually the case. One of them is just confusing code that you might come across. So something that happened to me recently was at work, we had this code that was supposed to cache values that were returned from an API to avoid excess API calls. And I knew that we did this, I knew why we did it, and I was building a new feature on some of the old code, and I couldn't figure out why we weren't caching the values there. And I assumed that I misunderstood it and that we should have been caching, or that, yeah, we shouldn't have been caching, but I was doing something wrong. And so I was stuck with this for a while, and eventually I had to go ask the developer who built the code. I said, hey, why aren't we doing that here? And he said, oh yeah, you're totally right. We should be caching there. We just missed it in that spot. And I felt so silly because I could have just added that code. I could have just realized we should have been doing this here. The code is wrong. I can add that feature. But instead, I was convinced that I was doing something wrong in that moment. Secondly, I think it's a stereotype that's absolutely true, is that engineers really love to have strong opinions. And that's okay, but when someone comes to you with a really strong opinion and you're experiencing imposter syndrome, it might be easy to feel as though they're telling you that you're wrong. So sometimes it's good to step back and consider, is their approach actually better, what they're suggesting, or are they just trying to say it louder so they have something to say? And finally, take their opinion into account. That's totally fine. They might be giving you valuable feedback, but also if you can remember everything that you do know, you can add it onto that instead of just overriding it with someone else's opinion. And finally, I think that it's important to note that everything in my presentation so far is going to be a lot stronger with people who are part of underrepresented groups in software engineering. So for instance, me as a woman in software engineering, I have a lot of fear of confirming stereotypes that people might have about women in engineering. And the only way that I've really found to counteract that is by having diverse representation in management. Right now, I have a female manager. Her name is Alexandra Sunderland. She just wrote a book. It's called Remote Engineering Management. She's great if you want to check her out. But having that diverse representation in management really made me feel as though I had someone that I could look up to, who I saw myself in, and I could see them being assertive and making decisions and being respected in the company. And it made it feel like it was okay for me to be part of this underrepresented group as well in software engineering. So you're wondering maybe whether I follow my own advice. I do, as much as really anyone can, I think. For instance, I'm always seeking opportunities to feel more confident in my skills by exiting my comfort zone. For instance, flying from Canada to Korea today to talk to you about all this. This is hugely out of my comfort zone, but here I am anyway. Something that's really helpful for me is being transparent about what I do and what I don't know when I'm responding to questions. That has helped me immensely in combating imposter syndrome, is just being very straightforward about the things that I'm confident in and the things that I have left to learn. And finally, always asking for help and clarification when I realize that I need it. And again, that might seem obvious, but it's much easier to do that than just be stuck in that position feeling too embarrassed by the fact that you don't know something. So finally, if you have any takeaways here, please remember to ask for help, make mistakes, and say, I don't know. Thank you very much.